In this video series, we're continuing to look at the classic work by John Stott, Basic Christianity. And so far we've looked at part 1, who Jesus is. We've looked at his claims, we've looked at his character, and we've looked at the historical evidence of his resurrection, which all points to what Christianity says about who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God and he is divine. But in this part, Stott is going to go on to look at what we need. Why do we even need Jesus? The focus of the New Testament in the Bible is not just who Jesus is, but what he came to do. And in order to understand what Jesus came to do, we need to understand ourselves, our own condition. Now, there was a movement in the 1800s that was theological liberalism, and it's continued on, but the idea was that humans are basically good at heart. We as humans are really essentially good. And there are a lot of people out there who continue to believe that. And that's understandable. Humans do a lot of good things. On the other hand, humans do a lot of bad things. And the 20th century, with the world wars and the rampant issues all around the world and the national conflicts, really reminded us of our inability to work things out and to have a peaceful world. And there has to be some explanation for that. It's also interesting that when we talk about civilized society, this is a society that we say is a good society, it's wholesome. What do we have to have in order to prop that up? We have to have laws. People don't just naturally do what is good. We actually have to have a law-based society in order to have a peaceful, structured society. So why is that? Well, that leads to a couple of points that Stott makes in this chapter on the fact and nature of sin. The first is that sin is universal. Now, I realize that sin is not something that you necessarily hear a lot about today. It's not a word we use a lot. The Old Testament depicts that everybody has sin. Everybody is in this particular condition. And in the New Testament, we see, for example, in what Paul says, that whether someone's religious or someone is not religious, whatever law it is that they are supposed to be following, whether that's a written law or whether that's something in their heart that they think that they're supposed to do, they don't do what they intend to do and what they know to be right. I think every one of us could admit, I'm not perfect. I don't do the things that I wish I would do at every moment of every day. I haven't, when I look back on my life, lived exactly the way that I would want to live. Sin is defined by either coming short or breaking the boundaries of the law. And so when you define sin that way, it helps you understand we all have this issue in our lives. We don't live the way that deep down we know we ought to. We might, for example, judge other people and say, oh, I hate that they did this, or oh, that made me so angry. But when we look at ourselves, we might begin to see, well, you know what? I've made other people angry. I haven't lived up to the expectations of others, and frankly, even my own expectations. So no matter what law it is we're going by, again, whether it's a written law from the Bible or whether it's just our own conscience, we break that at times, and it makes us feel very guilty. Now, a good way to look at this, Stott shows us, is to actually look at what the Bible's law is in the Ten Commandments. This isn't the only law that's given in the Bible, but you've probably heard of the Ten Commandments because it gives an overview of what God's law is like. The first part of the Ten Commandments is really how we relate to God, our Creator, that we are supposed to honor Him above all else, and we're not supposed to take His name lightly, and we're supposed to worship Him. And then the second part of the Ten Commandments is how we relate to other people. For example, we're supposed to be honoring to our family, especially our parents. We are supposed to make sure we give to others and not take from them. We're supposed to be faithful in our relationships, particularly our marriage relationships. And we're not supposed to desire what other people have and covet from them or lie about them and defame their name falsely. Well, when you begin to look at these commandments, Stott shows us, you see we've all broken it. We've all fallen short of what God wants for us. So that's just an example of how sin comes out in our lives, how we can see it. The second chapter in this part of the book deals with the consequences of sin. And there are three things that Stott points out that are a consequence of our condition. The first is our alienation from God. That sin has separated us from God on some level. It's the most terrible result of sin, actually. Because when we think about how we were created to be in a relationship with the one who made us, and to have joy and to have peace. But I think we would all agree that there's something wrong in our hearts. There's something missing in our lives. There's something off. And we're always searching for what that is. We often feel this sense of dissatisfaction, disillusionment, disappointment, hurt, anger, fear, all kinds of emotions that are just part of our human experience that have to do with being separated from our ultimate source of life and our ultimate relationship that we need with our Creator. That separation from God extends even beyond the life that we live in, and Jesus talked about the reality of eternal separation from God in a place he called hell. And that is the idea that because of God's holiness and our sinfulness, and because of this propensity that we have to reject God, ultimately we get what we desire, and we are separated from God. And that's what Jesus described as hell. And then the second aspect of sin is the bondage to the self. Stott says that sin not only separates, it enslaves us. Our outward sin is really just a symptom of something that's going wrong inside. And Jesus described this like a tree with fruit. A good tree, Jesus said, brings forth good fruit, and a bad tree brings bad fruit. And so when we look at what's going on in our lives and we see things that are not good, it's actually the result of something within us. And even though we want to do what's right, we don't. And you don't have to teach children, for example, this. You can tell your child, I don't want you to do this. That's not good for you. That's harmful. Stay away from that. Don't say that. Don't do this. And what do kids do naturally? They go against that law. The other thing is that no matter how much we want to do what is right, we still have this tendency to break what we know to be good. And God has told us, don't do this. Live this way. No matter how many times God says, you shall not and you shall, we continue to do the wrong thing. Now, I realize that there are many people who may have a hard time with what's being said here. We see that humans do a lot of good things, and that's absolutely true. But at the same time, I think we can all admit that we're not as good as we want to be. We're not as good as we claim to be. If everybody knew everything we thought, everything we felt, everything we deep down desired, they would see things that are not good. And then on a large scale, how do humans really operate? Are they really good to each other? Or do we have war? Do we really have the peace and love that we want society to reflect? And do we need laws? Do we just live the way that we should? Or do we need something outside of us to keep us in check and to help us to function in the right way? Well, when you look at these things collectively, you can see, wow, there really is evidence of something wrong. Finally, Stott looks at how sin brings the consequence of conflict with others. Sin, he says, is the reversal of how we were meant to live, which was to put God first, others second, and ourselves last. Is that how you live? Is that how I live naturally? No. Instead, we put ourselves first, and then we might think about others, and we put God, our Creator, last. We're ultimately self-centered. And Stott says that the characteristic of sin is the desire to get. The characteristic of love is the desire to give. I talked about this before, but Jesus ultimately demonstrated something about God, that God is a giving God. Jesus on the cross gave his own life and said, Father, forgive them. That is an incredible display of love and of giving of oneself. It's the opposite of how we tend to live. And so this section really shows us our condition. And we don't like to see this, but if we're honest with ourselves, we know that collectively, as societies, there's something wrong, but we also know that individually, there's something askew. There's something not the way it's meant to be. It's because of our separation from our Creator, and also our relationships with others have been severely hurt by our condition. And so In understanding our condition, we then are ready to understand why Jesus came. We've looked at who Jesus is, we've looked at our need, and now in the next part we're going to see, what did Jesus come to do?